So good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Mimi Plochet, the Artistic Director of the Chicago International Film Festival. Thank you all for joining us here on YouTube for this conversation about the film Louder Than a Bomb with director, producer Greg Jacobs and poet and subject of the film, Nate Marshall. Thank you both for being with us here. I wanted to reach out and just say thank you to Siskel Jacobs Productions for making the film available for the whole month of April in honor of National Poetry Month. I think it's a real gift to all of us who are stuck at home. So thank you, Greg.
We may be also making it available in May too.
Okay, great. Well, we'll get the word out. Louder Than a Bomb premiered in 2010. When we presented it in our documentary competition at the 46th Chicago International Film Festival. That year, the film, just at our festival alone, won the Audience Award for Best Documentary, as well as a special jury prize among countless other awards that it won at festivals around the country. So again, thank you both for being here, and I hope you're both well. So I'm going to start with some questions for both Nate and Greg. We encourage the audience to ask questions. You can ask them in the chat box if you're watching this on the Chicago International Film Festival's YouTube channel, and we'll get to as many of the questions as possible. So as I mentioned, the film premiered 10 years ago. However, it actually follows the students from the academic year of 2007 to 2008. So for me, revisiting the film after a decade, it just felt as fresh and inspiring as it did the first time I saw it, particularly in that culminating semifinals round performance of the Steinmetz students and their performance of Counting Graves. So Greg, though, I think it's 10 years old, but many people are seeing it for the first time. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process of like, how did you even connect with the Louder Than a Bomb competition with young Chicago authors, and like what drew you to this subject in the first place?
Yeah, thanks for having us. First of all, it's amazing how long ago it was. So it's like, let's see if we can peel this back out. We like so many documentary topics, it was a total fluke. Like I happened to be driving down Clark Street past the Metro with my wife one night and just instinctively looked up to see who was playing that night, and it said Louder Than a Bomb High School Poetry Slam Finals tonight, and there was a line of kids down the block of all, you know, shapes and sizes and colors and piercings and things, and it was like, what is that? Why, like, to see that kind of audience, young people lined up, a racially integrated audience of young people lined up on the north side to see poetry for fun was so alien to me. It was like, okay, we have to figure out what's going on. So I went back and I mentioned it to John Siskel, my co-director, and he's like, well, let's check it out. And so we got in touch with Kevin Koval, who's the artistic director of Young Chicago Authors and the co-founder of the festival. And he became kind of our tour guide for the next year or two, just taking us through to the various schools that and letting us understand the culture and the community of it. And a lot of times, you know, you start to investigate a documentary idea, and over time you kind of realize, not such a great idea. But in this case, every time, every new person we visit, every new story we heard, it was like, this is a good idea. And eventually you hear that enough and you're doing it. Like you don't know when it started or when it happened, you're just in it. And right. That's how the whole thing.
And then, so how did you decide, like the four essentially subjects who are a part of four different programs? Were you following more to begin with, or how did you end up with these four? Or were there like people that you had to edit out at the end because you just needed, like, in service of the narrative of the film?
We were spectacularly lucky. I mean, spectacularly lucky that the year before, when these guys were juniors in high school, they were all in the finals. So we went and we filmed the finals, and we had been sort of pointed out different kind of spectacular kids who were juniors who had a chance to kind of participate and go all the way competitively, but were also incredibly rich and remarkable writers at that age, and performers. And so by the time we got to the end of that, that spring before we started actually filming, it was pretty clear who the four subjects would be. And, you know, sort of equally miraculously, they represented a really interesting and diverse set of kids geographically and academically and racially, and all those, you know, things that made it, that sort of reflected the tapestry of Chicago that Young Chicago Authors and Louder Than a Bomb does. So, I mean, it just doesn't happen like that usually, but it's kind of a minor miracle.
That's great. So Nate, I think we have some fans watching, so I want to turn to you. You know, watching the film, your 18-year-old self already had a really strong sense of who you were and what you wanted to become, you know, a poet, a rapper, a mentor, an educator. I was hoping you'd talk about what it's like first to look back at yourself.
Yeah.
And then also, if you could tell us a little bit about your journey since graduating from Whitney Young. I remember at the end of the film, you say, I want to be a professor and or a rapper. And so,
Oh, Jesus. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, wait, so I guess the sort of, you know, I mean, I guess in terms of just like what I'm up to. So I'm a professor of English and creative writing at Colorado College in Colorado Springs. So that's where I am now. When I left Whitney Young, I went to Vanderbilt University, and then where I did a degree in English and African American diaspora studies, and then did a Master's of Fine Arts in poetry at the University of Michigan at the Helen Zell Writers Program. And so it's been sort of like, you know, I don't know. In some ways, it's felt kind of like a winding path, but in some ways, it's been like incredibly direct, like way more direct than perhaps anyone in history ever, except maybe like kids that are like, yo, I want to be in the NBA, and then they're like 20 and they're like in the NBA. Yeah, so, you know, I mean, it's been sort of fortuitous in that way. And I think really a series of happy accidents. So yeah, so I'm writing, I write, you know, poems, plays, all kinds of stuff. I do still rap, and still like work on music.
So everything has all
So
your
yeah, I mean, yeah, it worked out. Not, you know, I don't know. I don't think I was particularly smart as like a 17 or 18-year-old, but I think I was just lucky.
You were focused. And I mean, one of our audience members, Jack Murray, is asking, how did you discover your passion for poetry?
Yeah.
Was there something or someone that inspires you to write? And if so, who or what is it?
That's a good question. How did I discover my passion? It was, I think, a series of again, happy accidents sort of around like middle school, like kind of that 12 to 13 range. So it was, I would say, one, discovering the show Def Poetry Jam.
Okay.
And just being like, wow, this is really cool and really interesting. And I didn't know that sort of stuff could be like this. I specifically remember the first episode I ever saw, the poet Amiri Baraka was like the last performer on the episode. And I just remember being really struck by his poem. I like, funny, I still play it often for like classes that I'm teaching.
Okay.
I just like figure out some way to shoehorn it into what's happening. I'm like, hey, this is like a, you know, class about the novel, but y'all are just gonna watch this. I don't know. That's lucky. So yeah, so that was one thing. I think it was also like that was a point where at which I began to become really interested in hip hop and sort of wanting to rap. And that was, yeah, and that became like a basis of like my engagement with the play of language and with verse.
Right.
Yeah, and I was just like, and I think just growing up, like my grandmother was a big influence and she was a librarian. And so I grew up in a house like sort of with books and where there was a lot of space made for me to develop like various literacies. And so I think that those things kind of around that moment, and then, you know, I had a teacher that was like, we should try to do this Louder Than a Bomb thing. And I had no idea what it was. It was much, much smaller than what it was in the film and what it's been since the film. But, you know, I went that first time and I was kind of like, okay, cool. I like never want to leave this place. Like this is this is the coolest place. This is the place.
So there's a lot of interest in both of your processes. So one simple question is, what is your favorite place to write?
I really don't have one. I wish I had like a cool story. Mostly just like somewhere with sunlight.
Okay.
And that is relative, that is either like quiet or the noise is like not something that commands my attention, right? So I grew up, obviously like taking the train very far to school and all this sort of stuff. And so I can write with like a lot of sort of noise and stuff going around, so long as it doesn't like require me to tune in. That noise becomes a sort of silence. So.
Great. And I mean, I think for both of you, like what has, well, I'm going to actually first go to Greg about process too. Was part of, or did you feel that part of the filmmaking was the risk of not knowing what would happen, which is of course always part of the process of documentary filmmaking, is you're kind of going into the great unknown in some ways. This is also from Jacob Ahrens. And, how does that like kind of not knowing what you're going to get feed that process or direct it in some way for you?
I always describe it as like documentaries, or this kind of documentary at least, is like putting together a puzzle where you don't have the picture and you don't even know if you have the right pieces. And then you have to make it work. So no matter what, once you're in it, you got to make it work. Right. And I think for us, it was working every step of the way because, the kids, the then kids in the film were so great and so interesting and so compelling and so lively. And then we got to the night that spoiler alert, that the Steinmetz lost. And we went back, like we got all of our stuff and we went back to the office, and it was like, okay, we don't have them in the finals, we're doomed. And John, I remember we were getting out of the car and John said, well, all the other competition movies have the winners, but we don't. We have the losers. Maybe that's better. And I thought, you're an idiot. Like that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And then 3 days later, we went to Steinmetz, and you heard Lamar and talking in incredibly emotionally sophisticated and powerful ways about the lightning bolt of what the slam actually meant. And his kind of revelation. And once we had that conversation, it was like, oh, that, as is often the case in documentaries, the worse the world is, the better it is for us. So like the fact that had happened and that they had sort of understood the lesson of Louder Than a Bomb made everything fall into place. It tied it all up. And that's, I think, we knew we had a movie then.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways that you end the film that I also find really compelling is not just that there's a lesson learned, but there's a strong sense of community among the poets, whether it's within their teams working together or, coming together with students from across the city, kind of in a common goal. So I think one of the questions that we have is actually about the role that community plays for you in your writing, Nate. Like, how do you work within a community or take your inspiration from it, or kind of how does the community interact with your writing process?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. For me, it's really critical. Like there's really kind of no separation between those things. I think because I came up in spaces like Louder Than a Bomb, because I made a lot of my like very best friends in the world who are still writers, and we're still very much in community and in conversation with each other. I met through the festival writers like Jose Olivares or Diamond Sharp, Brittany Black Rose Capri. Yeah, and like, we've known each other since we were like 13, 14, 15. And so because of that, like for me, writing has always been this process of it's a thing that you do with your friends, right? It's a thing that you sharpen with your friends, like amongst your people, amongst your community. And also like I think one thing that we really had a strong sense of coming up through YCA and through Louder Than a Bomb was that writing had a real kind of power to like ignite discourse, make people think about things differently, be able to sort of rally people towards action or rally people towards a sort of deeper understanding. And so because of that, I think I really, as a writer, like approach the notion of the work that it is something that like that can and does like impact the world, and it should. And so for me, like that too is a community practice.
Yeah, and I mean, this feeds into kind of what my next question is, which is about the mantra that Greg just brought up, of the competition, of the Louder Than a Bomb competition, that the point is not the points, the point is the poetry.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how, one, you've taken kind of that, I guess, life lesson with you, which you seem to, of course, already understand when you were a senior, but how do you convey that to your students now, and how do you put that into practice?
Yeah. I think, one of the things for me is that I think the life of a writer is often a life that is rife with a lot of rejection. And so frankly, like coming up in a space like Louder Than a Bomb where I failed often, in some ways was really useful, right? Because it taught me a few things. Number one, like whether or not you get this thing or don't get this thing, or like make it to whatever the final stage, the version of final stage there is. And the thing that the work has a much longer trajectory and a much longer sort of life to it, right? Like, people are still having conversations about the power of, Nova's poem about her brother or about counting graves or whatever. And it doesn't matter, like nobody has any idea what those poems scored. And it in fact doesn't matter. But those things continue to shape discourse. So yeah, I think that is like a thing that I always carry with me, and I'm always like trying to articulate to students. And I think a lot of times, like a lot of students like just aren't that, especially students who aspire to be writers, they're not that familiar with failing in their writing, in part because if they're attracted to writing, like it's likely because someone told them, and maybe multiple people over like a bunch of time have told them, oh, you're a good writer, you should do this, da 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 da. And so it's always nice for me to be able to like pull that out and sort of model for my students, like, hey, look, here's the list of like 100 like literary journals that rejected poems that I submitted or whatever, right? Here's all the book contests I didn't win. Here's, all the way back to like the poetry slams where I got my ass kicked when I was 14. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love one of the things about the end of the film is like we get the sense that you win at the end, but that is not featured in the individual competition. So one of the questions is, well, I mean, and I think this goes back to what you're saying is that, the film actually itself clearly is at an impact because those performances live on or have lived on through the film. But I think the film also continues to have an impact because it still feels fresh and relevant today. So I was wondering if you could both talk about both the kind of the impact that the film has had on you personally and just kind of on the larger community in general.
Well, for me, one of the things that's fascinating is, going back and watching it again, I keep waiting for it to be out of date. And it will hit that moment. And I'm sure, Nate and the other folks in the film who are now entering their 30s go like, I wore those pants, or I can't believe I had that phone. And, who's Dan Marino? There isn't a 13-year-old in the country who is like, oh, Dan Marino, I get that reference. So the references and some of the fashions are maybe dated, but what's amazing to me, the thing I kept waiting for is, when is the problematic comment going to come? When is the thing that maybe 13 years ago was acceptable and is no longer acceptable? When is that going to be said or happen? And it doesn't happen. And I think that's testament to is, first of all, a generation of kids who was, occupying these incredibly diverse spaces that were so diverse that it was just the air they were breathing, and it didn't have to be commented on in a lot of ways. And also being spaces that were being structured by grownups who also could then teach them how to speak language that was radically diverse in that way, and to care about craft and to care about precision and work, which is, I guess, a Chicago thing too. And so, like, to me, the remarkable thing looking back is like we were present at the creation of a generation of like now artists and teachers and advocates and activists who have changed the world and are certainly changing Chicago and are changing poetry. And that's amazing to me. So part of what makes it, I think, evergreen is that you had a bunch of people who are learning to speak a language that is now the language that kids speak. And I think that's sort of remarkable. And I think also the sort of the community of poets and writers and artists that's emerged from that 5 years is representative of that.
Yeah, and I also think that part of it, I mean, the power of the film is the reminder of like the power that poetry and art has in our lives, whether it is writing or cinema. You know, the way that it brings people together, produces empathy and understanding and connection between people, and also reveals a shared humanity. And finally, it just makes us feel on a heightened level, which I was reminded of watching the film again last night. So one question that we have for Nate, which I think relates to that, is what would your life be like if poetry were taken out of it?
I literally have no idea. I mean, like, and I don't say that but like, you know, I was sort of thinking about this question of like the impact of the film on us personally. And for me, like, everything about the experience of Louder Than a Bomb, like just taking part in the festival and being a part of YCA, and certainly the experience of being a part of the film has like fundamentally shaped my trajectory as a person. You know, because I'm a writer, because I'm a teacher of writing. But also just like, you know, like my partner is she's a poet as well. And like, I met her because like I read her poem somewhere, and I think I like just like messaged her on Facebook and was like, hey, I really like this poem. Actually, funny enough, the poem that I messaged her about was it was after the Amiri Baraka poem that was the one I saw in Def Poetry that struck me. And so I was like, yo, I fucks with this poem. I dig this poem, and like I know the reference, like I see you. And then we were like, you know, very friendly for like many years on the internet. And like now we live together in Colorado. So, you know, I mean, like quite in like quite foundational ways. Like this has been you know, it's really inconceivable for me to like imagine my life without poetry, because my entire professional life, you know, much of my social life, my romantic life has been shaped by my relationship to poetry and literature and my identity as a poet. Yeah. Question. Hold on. Can I see what is it, Aaliyah from Kumba Links asking some questions in here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Wow.
So yeah, I just want to, you know, respect to the poet. So I want to answer.
Oh, so I mean, I can ask it. The one that I'm getting from her is, if you had one thing you would want to change or fix about your performance, what would it be?
Yeah. That's a really that's an interesting question, Aaliyah. So like,
That's
the
awesome.
thing I'm thinking about with that is, I think about how different the moment that we were where we were making the film and where I was performing in is than the moment that young people are really operating in now, which is that like most of our stuff was not recorded, and we really weren't like very accustomed. Like it was a really special occasion when something could be recorded, either like, you know, either on film or frankly even like written down. Like to have a poem in a book or to have a poem published somewhere was much less common for us than I think it is for like the young people who I have worked with and mentored in Chicago and in other places now. Even, you know, about a decade like just later. Yeah. And so I don't know if there are things that I would fix or change, because I think how we were really engaging our work was as live performance artists, right? Which
Right.
meant that each time that we were doing a poem, like it had a particular energy and filled a particular room in a certain way, right? So like Greg remembers probably the first time that I did the poem Look in public at semifinals. And that's not in the film, but it was in the same bout as Steinmetz, right? So that poem filled that room in a particular way because there was a tension, because we knew it was a close bout, because whatever. And I was also anxious and like tense because it's like, if I don't score high here, then that's it. And it was right after, I think, Lamar, one of the folks from Steinmetz had like really raised the stakes and like gotten like a 29-9 or something. And I was like, well, damn, I'm not making finals. So, you know what I mean? Like, I think we were really focused on how the work fills the room in that particular moment.
Right.
Whereas I think now, when I perform, right, when I do things, there's a much greater sense that everything I'm doing is recorded.
Right. Has that changed then, kind of how you think about performance?
Maybe. I think in some ways it makes precision, or a certain kind of precision, more important. Whereas like, I think probably when I was competing in Louder Than a Bomb, you might drop a line of a poem or sort of break sort of the character of the stage in order to like work with the audience or engage with the people who were there, in a way that I feel like I maybe see young people doing less. And I feel like even I would do a little bit less if I were doing that sort of performance.
Right.
Now, right? Because there wasn't really a sense of like posterity. Like the only posterity that came out of, performing for, I did Loud in the Bomb for like 6 years. The only posterity that came out of the vast majority of that time was if people were like, yo, Nate got busy on stage. Like Nate did his thing. Right. There was no there's no video that you're rocking for. So I think it does change somewhat the relationship that you have to the form. It's not better or worse. It's just different.
Just different, yeah, and more lives in memory or word of mouth. I think people are looking for inspiration here, and just kind of again going back to process. Like, how do you, especially since we're all stuck at home, how do you discover your voice? Like, what process do you go through to find your own voice as a writer? And do you have any advice about that?
Yeah. I think when I decided I wanted to become a writer, or when I became interested in writing, I think I began to develop a reading practice. And so for me, my first desires around writing were really like that I wanted to be an MC. I wanted to rap. And so for me, like I thought about who are the rappers that I like and what is it that I think either I like about them or that I sort of see them all in common, right? And I noticed like, oh, well, rappers are always referencing all these things in the world. They're referencing current events and sports and politics and literature and all this sort of stuff. And like the slang in their neighborhood and, like what, people around them are doing or what they're doing or whatever. So for me, that showed me like, oh, I have to be a really disciplined, just payer attentioner. Right. So I started reading, I read like 2 or 3 newspapers a day. And then I read, this is weird. I was maybe the youngest subscriber to the New Yorker. When I was like 13 or 14, I had like a subscription to the New Yorker for a while, and I would just like read the New Yorker. I don't know why. But I would like read whatever I could get my hands on. I would listen to as many records as I could. Because I think often I think all of us, as we're developing voices and refining our voices, even now, like, at this point, I'm over 15 years into a sort of writing career and trajectory. You're still like constantly influenced and you're sort of biting from everyone. And so I think the more stuff you can throw in that pot, and the stronger of a sense you get of what you like and what you think works when you do it. And the more you can sort of cultivate what might approach a unique point of view.
And I think similar, and this question is from the same person, it's Ajahn Wiley. Do you think that poems can help people who want to do music? So, I mean, you clearly saw a connection between poetry and music, going to the rappers that you liked, but
Yeah.
and are there poems that you think more easily turned into lyrics for music?
That's a good question. I mean, that is such a huge question. I think that you know, music and poetry have a long history, right? The earliest poems that we know of in human history were likely sung as a means of delivery. Yeah, now I'm on like my professor. So yeah, I mean, these things have a deep relationship. I think if you are interested in pursuing music, then poetry is a good thing to study and learn about, because they just share so much, right? A sense of rhythm, a sense of sound, the need for brevity, right? Or relative brevity, as a means of like carrying a story or carrying a feeling. So yeah, I mean, I think that those things are deeply related. This is random. So currently I'm teaching this like 3-week intro to poetry class for Colorado College, but I'm like posting it online because why not? I don't have anything better to do. So if you're like more interested in this kind of stuff, you can like follow me on Twitter, and there's a bunch of, I'm like sort of putting together a bunch of resources, and I'm in the mornings, yeah, like late mornings, early afternoon, depending on where you're at in the continental US. I'm doing lectures most days about sort of topics of poetry. So yeah, and we'll talk about like sound and music at some point. So
Great.
One of the things also real quick, just like that I think is kind of amazing, is that since we've shot the film, I used to, at the time I would describe to people like, oh, we'll sort of think of poetry and the slam as like, if poetry, if spoken word and hip hop are cousins who talk all the time and hang out and really, really love each other, poetry and spoken word are like, poetry is hosting Thanksgiving and really doesn't want spoken word to come, but they know they have to open the door if they do. And since then, it seems like in the last 10 years, you've kind of like, they've become cousins again. Like, like that you've sort of knocked the door down. You're the whole generation that was around that time, that now the establishment recognizes that the boundaries are much more porous than they.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and kind of related to that, and maybe some of this is kind of what you're covering in your class and the Twitter feed and this is a question for both of you actually, are there poets or poems, I guess right now as we're sheltering in place, that you're particularly turning to? And the same goes for films. Is there a director, a particular film that, Greg, you might be turning to, whether it's for comfort or inspiration at this time that you can put out there?
For me, especially at the beginning of this, and I don't think it was conscious, I found myself wanting to watch movies that have single moments that inevitably make me cry. Or the moments just make, I can't help it, it's so great, like with happiness. So like the examples are the scene at the end of Purple Rain when they're actually playing Purple Rain and Prince spins around and kisses Wendy on the cheek. Every time. I can barely even say that without like crying. Every time. It's like, oh God. Or Lawrence's keyboard solo in School of Rock. Like every time, it just makes me so happy. So I think I was just subconsciously like searching out movies that had those moments that make me
like moments of catharsis for you.
Moments of catharsis, moments of like pure cinematic joy.
Yeah. What about you, Nate?
That's so tender. All right. I mean, a bunch of things, a lot of like sort of, because I'm probably teaching this class, I've been sort of reading and thinking a lot about poetry. The poet Yvonne Boland, who's an Irish poet who just passed away yesterday. So I spent a lot of time yesterday with her interviews and some of her poems. She has a great poem called Quarantine, like Ode to Suburbia. Yeah, she's great. I've been reading this book that reminds me of like a lot of the things that Greg was sort of talking about, killing poetry, Blackness and the Making of Slam and Spoken Word Communities by Javon Johnson. Who actually, when he was working on like the dissertation version of this, interviewed me and a couple other folks. And I think Lamar, like from Loud on the Bomb, because he did his PhD at Northwestern. So I've been working my way through that. I have like a humongous pile of books over here that I won't even like get into. But I'm trying to think, what else? You know what I've been like super on in terms of films is rewatching like some TV shows that I like. So like rewatching The West Wing. Because it's so sort of triumphant. It's like such an optimistic show in a way that kind of fucking annoys me. I'm sorry, I don't know if whatever. I find it sort of annoying, but sort of really endearing. And then also I'm watching now The Sopranos because I just never saw that. And I've been watching a lot of like parodies. So I'm like really, I think a thing I've been thinking a lot about is the relationship between poetry and humor. And so I've been watching like what did there's this really funny parody of sort of romantic comedies called They Came Together. That it was hysterical. And then there's this great parody that the Wayans brothers did of sort of all of those like kind of Black like hood movies that happen.
I'm gonna get you, sucker.
Yes, it's like it's called like Don't Be a Menace in South Central Without Drinking Your Juice in the Hood.
Oh right, yeah.
So love that one. I mean, Hollywood Shuffle is like sort of a similar thing to this. Yeah, and I have this book that always sort of sits by my desk. You can hardly see. It's called The Book of Negro Humor, and it was compiled by Langston Hughes, but it's all these like little jokes and funny stories and whatever. So I'm always like, this is the thing I'm thinking about too. Again, like this relationship between poetry and humor, or like, you know, spoken word performance poetry, that thing out of which I come as a sort of cousin, right? At this hypothetical Thanksgiving dinner, like the other cousin is like stand-up comedy, right?
All right, yeah.
So I have a question here from, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I have a question here from Kate Hong, which maybe relates to the Langston Hughes book that you have. Do you think that race, religion, and or gender affects the type of poetry that's written, or kind of what is the role of that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you know, I think like, how can I say this? The thing I've been toying with, like the lecture I gave today to sort of kick off this intro to poetry class was called The Noticing Discipline, right? Which, you know, it's a thing I sort of say to students is like, poetry is a discipline of noticing, right? It's a discipline that requires you to pay attention. And like, that's like really your job as a poet, right? In the same way a surgeon has to have a steady hand, you have to have like, you know, you just have to pay attention, right? And so what you pay attention to and how you pay attention to it is fundamentally impacted by, I think, your subject position and the subject position of people around you. So like, for example, a thing I remember from like Louder Than a Bomb is when I first started going to LTAB, I was like 12, 13. And I'm from like the far south side of Chicago. I went to school on the sort of southwest side in like a predominantly sort of Irish Catholic neighborhood that had a sort of weird tension and relationship to the school because the school was a magnet school. So it was like a very good school, but the kids in the community often couldn't test in, right? And the school was very diverse and the community was not. Like this is one of, I think, 2 neighborhoods in Chicago that voted for Trump. So whatever that means. But so my perception of white people, right, coming up was that they're all Irish Catholic, and that, or at least all Catholic, right? You might be like Polish or Italian or whatever, but you're just, everyone, like white people are Catholic. That's like what they do. That's how they get down. And that they may or may not be like deeply, deeply hostile to you, right? That was like my perception as a young person. So I remember first going to Louder Than a Bomb and being on the north side really for the first time with any meaningful time and seeing white people with Stars of David on. And I didn't know I thought that they were gang members because I thought they were GDs because that was what the Star of David meant to me. So yeah, absolutely, like a kid who has that relationship to race, to religion, in a hyper segregated city is going to write a particular thing. A kid who's on the other side of that is going to write another thing, right? Ad infinitum.
Yeah, one of the things that I actually kind of love about the movie is that, I think you can be very reductive about those relationships too.
Yeah.
And so the notion at the end when Lamar says, Nate, he and Nate never had two words for each other. It's like, here are two young Black men who would fit in the category in anything else that you're reading or seeing as, young Black men, but they're from different planets in a lot of ways and share a lot of coarse, identical experiences and and don't share a lot of experiences and may not have crossed their paths. So the way I think the film portrays different gradations, different individualities within the categories that we might assign to them is one of the things that actually makes it more evergreen.
Yeah.
It's about the diversity, even in that subset of Black men. And
it was a much bigger deal that me and Lamar and the Steinmannats were like cool at the end of that year of competition than it was that like me and Adam, because me and Adam had been friends. We had been cool since like freshman year or whatever. Yeah. Like, but Steinmetz, it wasn't like beef because it's poetry, but you know what I mean? But there was absolutely a sort of tension there because in the course of Steinmetz winning the prior year, one of like the team they beat in semifinals was my team. And like that was a team that I think a lot of people in the competition and certainly us who were on the team felt like could win had they gotten the finals. So there was a ton of tension there.
Yeah.
And Steinmetz and Whitney Young have a sort of like weird contentious history like anyway, right? So yeah, I mean, I think like, yeah, often like the sort of, what is it? Chimamanda Adichie, she says like the danger of a single story, right?
Right.
I think that there are these really like simple narratives about, who and what populates the city when you see something like Louder Than a Bomb. And the more you learn about it, the more you find that those things are like really aren't they really don't hold very well.
Right. And I think it's a trap that documentaries can really fall into.
Yeah.
Where it's like, here's a vulnerable population and, that's what we'll call it. And right away, we've already pigeonholed it as certain kinds of people who behave certain kinds of ways. And so, for even within the Steinmetz team, you've got, Kevin, Lamar, and Big C are completely different personalities and people. And different types in a way. So it's one of the things that I think is enduring and I really like about the movie now, that many years later.
So we have a question about, so somebody wrote, after I watched Louder Than a Bomb, I feel that I might want to write poetry, which is exactly what we want, or join a poetry club in high school. So just in general, how do you start and where do you look to become involved and how do you get so good is the question.
Yeah, I think, because I'm a beneficiary and an alum of these kinds of things, I think I really believe in the sort of, local writing program, local writing project. So if you're in Chicago or around Chicago, I would say check out places like Young Chicago Authors, like 826 Shy, like U Media down at the library. But, I think even if you're not in those places or a place that has a kind of similar program or like youth center or whatever, especially now, like a lot of places are just throwing their stuff online. So like I'm one of the judges, I think Thursday is Louder Than a Bomb individual finals. So you can like just go on YCA's like social media or on their website and find information for that. But I think that there's like a ton of opportunities now, given the strength of the internet and given the current moment we're in, to really like connect across difference. and across distance. So like those are things I would suggest to you. I also would suggest just like reading. Um, you know, a thing that I do is there's a podcast called The Slow Down Show that the poet Tracy K. Smith does. And I listen to that every morning. Just as a good way to like, it's like 5 minutes, you get a single poem from a single poet, and you get exposed to a lot of different stuff over the course of, you know, if you listen to that for a month, you'll hear 30 different voices. And so that's useful. And also the Academy of American Poets has an email subscription service called Poem a Day. And so I think like little stuff like that, where it's like, it doesn't take a lot of your time, but you can just plug into the art form every day, are helpful. But in terms of like writing, you just gotta write, just sit in the chair, just try it, you know, and it's gonna be bad and you're gonna be frustrated, and then it'll get slightly less bad and you'll be like, oh dang. And then one day, like the thing that you thought was really hot, you'll look back at it and be like, wow, that was trash. But that's like the beauty of the process, right? Is that, you know, if it was weightlifting, like you're constantly sort of putting more weight on the bar, or you do it with the more, you know, with more regularity and the more intensity of study.
And one thing also, just to give a shout out to the adults who make it possible. Like it can't be just a 12-year-old's responsibility to say, I'm going to write and be a poet. Like there have to be grown-ups that they can latch onto somewhere who form that, like that support mechanism that whether, you know, you hope maybe it's a parent, but it's often not, but you hope it's a teacher you can go to and say, hey, you're the English teacher, can you help me? Because I think the sort of secret heroes in the movie are the James Sloans and the Peter Kahns and the Liz Graffs, the teachers who were the ones who created the structures that the kids could thrive in. And Kevin and all the YCA adults too.
Yeah, I think you do a nice job in the film of keeping the kids, the poets front and center, but also showcasing that they do have the support system around them. So we get enough of the backstory to know that it's there, but obviously they're the stars of the film.
Yeah.
We only have a little bit more time left. So I first want to, I guess I want to, have you guys talk about Ellen Zippick is asking where the other poets who are featured in the film are now and what they're up to, and if you know that.
Yeah.
I, mostly through Facebook, for better and for worse. So, we know like Adam is around Chicago and doing great things as a teacher and poet and activist and performer, doing a lot of musical work too, I think. Nova has a kid and is out in Oak Park and seems to be doing well. And, I sort of just kind of know what's up basically with the Steinmannots. And I think with everybody, there's been, it's been 13 years since that was filmed. So like in every life or group of people, there are, great moments and there are tragedies and there are illnesses and there are, happinesses. And I think they've had their share of that, but I think everybody seems to be doing okay. And just about everybody is still around Chicago. So
and you mentioned before too that they're all more or less, or many of them are still writing.
Yeah, I think so. So I probably the person I keep up the most with still is Adam. Like when I'm in the city, we see each other at least a few times a year. And I know he has a manuscript that he's sort of shopping around, a manuscript of poems. And then he also like has a band. So he's doing sort of work as a musician as well. So he's definitely still writing, still creating, helping like administrate this open mic program and sort of like program kind of similar to YCA in scope, and who participate in Louder Than a Bomb, out in the kind of like far field suburbs, kind of like northwest, deep northwest. So yeah, he's doing that. Last time I talked to Lamar, which is maybe like last summer, we did a thing up in Milwaukee together, and he's still writing, still working on stuff, and like working I think downtown. I think Nova has like some new poems coming because Peter Kahn has from Oak Park. They're doing a sort of 20th anniversary anthology of the Oak Park program, because a lot of really incredible writers have come through that program, but who are both writing and also doing things all over. So like the NBA player Iman Shumpert came through that program. Langston Kerman, who was like a few years older than me, but I competed with, he like is a stand-up comedian who's been on Insecure and wrote for the Oscars when Chris Rock was hosting the Oscars and all this sort of stuff. Like, and he has an MFA, which is funny. Yeah, it's great because whenever he's in town or whatever, and he does a stand-up bit, and he knows that there's poets in the audience, he has like a few bits about like poetry or about the sort of absurdity of having an MFA, which he'll pull out. But yeah, so all these great people have like come through Oak Park, so they're doing an anthology collecting that work, and I think Nova has like some new poems in that, so I'm excited for that. But yeah, I mean, folks, as far as I have kept up with, are like relatively good, and I think like whenever we're able to like get together and chat, it's always a pleasure.
Yeah. So I wanted for both of you to talk kind of about what's next. We do have a question for Greg about his motivation for making this film, which I think we covered a bit, but I also just was wondering if you could talk about your kind of motivation or what draws you to any subject. I know you have a film that's going to be ready later this year, that's coming out later this year, The Road Up. So if you could just generally talk about kind of what draws you into a subject when you and John kind of think about what's next.
I think, it's a combination of, is this something that, we don't know about, that we can learn about, and that we may not be able to learn about any other way except to horn in with a camera and get people's trust and acceptance. That's always great. We love watching people do things they love, which is, always fun. And I think increasingly we're starting to, with our most recent film and the one that's almost, that's going to be out soon, really starting to see the power that film can have for impact and to make change. And I think we were introduced to that with Louder Than a Bomb, because the film helped seed Louder Than a Bombs in cities all over the country. But I think we're really starting to understand how a documentary film can be used for advocacy, and that's cool. But the thing that I always now talk about, because it's like Nate was saying, it's a thing that makes sense only in retrospect and is not planned at all. But I think the unifying factor in all of these, in the 3 feature documentaries that we've made, is just the power of connection and community and love. It's sort of like everything else is commentary. And I think, when watching this again, after however long, and you just see the incredible saturation of love in the film among the participants and among the teachers and the parents, you just like, something about that draws us, and how fundamentally important that is in all of our lives. And I think if you can make a movie that brings that out, that's a victory.
Great. Well, we look forward to seeing The Road Up. Nate, I know you have a book of poetry coming out this summer. Would you be willing to share something with us?
Sure. Yeah, I guess let me pull up a document. Oh man.
So I guess while you're doing that, talk about the title so we all know where to find it.
Yeah. So the book, what's up?
It doesn't work again. Like, the cover's too big.
The book is called Finna, and it's coming out like early August. So I'm excited for that. It's the second full-length book of poems, and I don't know what else to say about it. I'll read this. This is the first poem in the book. So what do you need to know about this poem? I kind of wrote this poem after moving to Colorado. It's like one of the last poems in the book that I wrote. And part of why I wrote this was I was really struck by, in where I'm at in Colorado, there's a much more pronounced like indigenous presence, much more pronounced Native American presence than anywhere I've ever lived before. And so given that there's a real, like land acknowledgements are a thing that are much more commonplace, right? than certainly when I was growing up. And even like in the last few years, Louder Than a Bomb has started to do sort of land acknowledgements and whatnot to open up events, but even still. So I was sort of just thinking about that practice and thinking about, thinking about like what, the nature of a land acknowledgement, particularly as like a Black person in this country. So this poem is called Landless Acknowledgement. Before we get started, we would like to acknowledge that we live on some unceded bones. Sometimes me and mine imagine ancestral homes. All I got so far is Montgomery, Alabama. Maybe a boat, maybe a plot of land somewhere so far from the South Sides I've claimed that I would get lost on the way. I admit, sometimes my homies talk about their families immigrating and I get jealous. We lost the land we were custodians over before I was a twinkle in the eye of a twinkle in the eye of a twinkle in the eye. Closest I got to a homeland is my mama's Caucasian pitch on the phone calling the police. Closest I got to a homeland is not never calling the police. Closest I got to a homeland is my daddy's laugh in a spades game. Closest I got to a homeland is my lover's tongue talking or otherwise. Closest I got to a homeland is the funk under a DJ's needle and my hand full of a dance partner. Not to be dark, but I am. Not to be dark, but the planet is on fire. Not to be dark, but they move in capitals because the water is coming up. Not to be dark, but our bones are in that water too. Maybe that's my capital. Once the polar capitals melt and there's a whole lot less land for folks to buy and sell and steal, maybe everybody will feel a little more dark, will feel a little more homelandless like we do. Why you think I call my compatriots homies? Maybe ain't no home except for how your beloveds cuss or pray or pronounce.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to thank you both so much for joining us here for this hour. Greg, thanks for sharing the film to you and John. Get the word out if it's going to be live streaming one more month on your website. We'd love for as many people to see it and be inspired by the film, by Nate, and by the other poets. So if there's anything else you two want to share.
No, just
well,
good.
What's up?
Good to see people.
Yeah, it's great to see and be seen. Louder Than a Bomb is going, it's the 20th year. And now they're doing the team finals and the individual finals online, so that the students can like still have that sort of culminating moment. And so those things are happening this coming weekend from Thursday, I think, to Saturday.
I think
so
we put the link for the Facebook, for the YouTube live,
okay.
page, and we can put that in the chat so people know where to find it. Yeah,
so come through to that'll be like a great moment for the young people. Yeah.
And I point people to louderthanabombfilm.com, where the film is streaming now and will be streaming. I think we finally decided yes all the way through May. And two plugs, if you are inspired and feeling especially generous, also to think of the work that YCA is doing and possibly even make a donation, because it is amazing work, and as everyone is struggling to figure out how to get through all this. And also for the people who make it possible for us to do our work, the people who work in the movie theaters and are also struggling because those are not open, to the Cinema Workers Fund, which the festival has helped to start. Please support them as well.
Yeah, we can put all those links in the chat box. So thank you so much again. Great to see you. And we look forward to what's next for both of you. So thank you for inspiring us today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.